Okay, we'll have to remove LinkedIn. For some reason, it won't let us. Okay. We're also live on YouTube, so we're all set there.
All right. We live.
That was my question, Christy.
Oh, okay.
Maybe Jason knows. How do we know as people log on?
Yeah, I don't know what view count you might have.
What I don't know is where that is.
Yeah.
Well, at the very least, we can get started. And of course, this is going to be a recording that's made available later. And we can go from there. I did post the link on all of the socials to join both through Facebook as well as through YouTube. And so as people join, we'll acknowledge them as we go here. So I just want to welcome everyone to what we're calling at Relay, a shift out of neutral, a path towards anti-racism. And if you're new to StreamYard, just notice that there's a comment section. I've already shared some resources, some links to resources in the comment section. That's going to appear on both Facebook, my personal Facebook page, as well as in the YouTube comments. And these are just links to anti-racist resources, as well as a Google Doc that's full of allyship resources, because I started thinking of the resources I wanted to share, and it was hard for me to narrow it down. I do have 2 books that I think are primer things that people need to read that we'll share at the end. But just put questions, comments, all in the comment box of the dashboard within StreamYard. I would like to introduce who's with us here today. And so we'll start with Christy Bertolo. We've got our name, so we know who Christy is. Christy is the Director of Corporate Engagement at The Ohio State University. And then we have Amber DeBar, who is the Director of Marketing with Ohio Health. Rich Johnson, pastor of Sanctuary Church. Ryan Wilkins, a Senior Director of Communications and Facilities, Ronald McDonald House, right here in Central Ohio. Jason Otero, Community Engagement Manager of Relay, and I'm Shannon Lee, Executive Director at Relay. And Jason and I are staff members of Relay, and everyone else these are 4 members of our 8-member board now, right?
Yeah.
4 members of our 8-member board, yeah. So welcome everyone to this live stream. This is the first time we're using this platform, so we're all a little tentative and trying to figure everything out. So pardon me while I look around and make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, so here's what you can expect as you listen along with us and engage. We're wanting to engage in a discussion really with the staff and the board of Relay on anti-racism. I'm gonna give you a little bit of a background on our journey as an organization, kind of how we got to this place, and give you my perspective on what was the catalyst, at least for me, that brought some of us to this moment. And then I'm going to give the board members a chance to kind of give their perspective as well on that, which really will lead us to our why for tonight. As I said, we're inviting everybody to comment and to ask questions. I want to be clear, however, that we're, excuse me, not trying to convince anyone that we're right about something. I think that's part of white privilege. I think a lot of, I'll speak for myself. I'm a fan of using I statements that I think a lot of times I speak in ways that I'm so convinced that I'm right. And we've joked about this before because it's so true. It's funny. We have assessments, and I have assessments that tell me that I think I have great ideas. And so I've had to learn over the years to humble myself and allow people to speak into my life. And it's a great thing, because all minds are better than my mind alone. And that is certainly true when it comes to matters of anti-racism. And so I think that we want to be clear and explain to anyone listening in that we're not setting ourselves up as the expert, but rather setting this stage for learning. We are trying to reach others who, you're going to hear a little bit about our perspective and what brought us here to this evening. But for others who may have been in our shoes or are in our shoes, felt like they want to or need to move forward, maybe afraid to move forward, not sure how to step into anti-racism. and more importantly, are willing participants in this, but just might be unsure of what to do. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. And who are willing to take a courageous step into anti-racism that I used to see it as really courageous, and now I just see it as like, this is necessary. This is a no-brainer. But I think once you take that step, you realize this isn't really even more about courage. This is like, I can't not do it, which is a double negative. I know that's horrible English, but that's the best way I know how to express it. So a few things I want to address. We are really speaking to white people. Everyone is welcome here, but we are speaking to white people. We don't believe that people of color need our help explaining anti-racism. But everyone is welcome into this discussion. We are inviting white people because we want to, like we're challenging ourselves, we want to challenge others around what we'll call neutrality. It's a place where we find ourselves, where we think we're playing it safe. We're being apolitical, and we're not, what are some of those things? We don't want to rock the boat, as people say, or shake things up. We don't want to cause any problems or cause a, drama. And so we have these negative associations sometimes with taking a stand. And what we're going to talk about tonight is how that actually, that there is not a neutral impact. There's an impact to that decision. And that's why we don't believe there actually is a neutral place. This might mean that you feel uncomfortable tonight. It might mean that there's some things you don't understand and that you're challenged in ways that cause you to bristle or react. And that's okay. It's to be expected. As I mentioned before, this is half of our board. The entire board was invited. Our board is more diverse than what you're seeing here, but only slightly so. We want to admit that diversity on our board is an area where we need to grow. And that is part of what we're learning. And what I want to be careful to point out is this isn't just us acknowledging we need to grow there. This has become a part of our strategic plan. It's one thing to recognize we need to do something and to kind of mentally ascend to something, and then to actually put policies and procedures in place. Because the author of How to Be Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi, and if I can't find it readily, I'll find it later. Oh, it's right here. He's talking about discrimination, but I think this is an important point. He says, we all have the power to discriminate, but only a few exclusive people have the power to make policy to change discrimination. And I think that that's what's important. Relā doesn't have the power to change big policy, like national or state policy. But wherever you find yourself, if you have a way to influence or change policy around these things, that might be where you need to start your work. And so it's not enough to just be against racism and to enter into anti-racism, but to be a part of anti-racism is to make changes where you have power to make those changes. As I said, we're not here as experts, we're here as learners, and we're inviting all of you to join in and learn alongside with us. We're not going to get to every topic tonight. There's just way too much to discuss. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background, and then I'm going to turn it over to the people that are with me here tonight who I've already introduced. So this organization history goes back 30 years, really, more than 30 years now. And it started out as a local chapter of a national organization, and that national organization was a men's only organization. Only 2 years into their local chapter, they began to openly invite, welcome, and celebrate the presence of women at their events. Now, I know we're saying this is only 30 years ago. You're like, oh, wow, great, congratulations. I get it. But here's the thing. Back in the day, at that time, it was a very popular thing to have men-focused organizations focused on empowering fathers specifically. And for a men's-only organization to say, you know what, we believe in engaging a broader demographic that includes women, that was a big deal. And so we're really proud of that part of our history. And ever since then, we have willingly grappled with questions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that continues to be an ongoing evolution. And when we started to transition from what that organization was, which I will loosely define as more of an event-based organization, to an organization that has events but focuses on leadership development as our primary operating function in the community, we started to look at who was coming to our training programs, not just our events. Who was, and not just from a position of race, but how old are they? what's their experience level? What's their industry? What's their race and ethnic background? A recent one that's another board member challenged us around. What about disabilities? There are all kinds of ways we can look at diversity and inclusion in any organization. But as we started to look at that, we realized that a lot of our ideas over the last 3 or 4 years, we weren't really finding a lot of traction with that. And last year at our board retreat, we were all sitting around once again discussing what we were going to put into our strategic plan around DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of our board members, who she could not be here tonight, she challenged all of us in the room and really brought it home. And I think I speak for everyone on our board, and I know I speak for everyone on this live stream right now, just because I've heard from all of you. And that is that it challenged us to our core, because what she asked us to do, she said, there's no way you're going to create a more diverse participant in your programs. There's no way we're going to create a more diverse board, a more diverse staff, until each of us individually starts to embrace this idea of diversity personally. And she said, I'm going to give you one challenge. I want you to take a look at your social feeds, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. And I want you to just start scrolling through and see how many people look like you. And I remember she pointed to her skin color, and she's a Black woman, but she pointed to her skin color. And she said, now, let me tell you, I do the same thing for me. I make sure that my social feeds don't all look like me. She said, but I want you all to do that. And she meant like after the retreat was over, right? And she said, now what I want to challenge you to do is to start to follow people. Just start following people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't believe like you. Just actively look for differences and start following them. And so on one of our breaks, I just started looking at my social feeds, and yeah, 85, 90% of my feed, they all look like me, meaning they had white skin. And so that's where I started. I made a commitment to start following creators, thought leaders, authors, influencers, you name it, on every platform that I have a social media presence, follow people who were different from me. What I didn't know was other board members were doing the same thing. We started sharing resources, like, look what I'm learning, look who I followed. And through that, and I'll even mention who it was, I found my first anti-racist person who has dedicated their life to anti-racism. His name is Andre Henry. He doesn't know I exist. But I don't know, how many of you have heard of Andre Henry on here? Okay, so I follow him on Twitter, is where he has his strongest presence, I believe. And I just started listening to him. And then I started getting thirsty for more anti-racist information. And then I started realizing he was saying stuff that what I'll call reading my mail. And what I mean by that is he would say things, I was like, oh, I've thought that before. I didn't realize that was a part of structural racism, or I didn't realize that was part of veiled racism. And I really wanted to change those things. I love all people and didn't think I was racist, and started realizing how much of systemic racism was at work in my own life and in my own attitudes. Then I start sharing this with other board members, and I start buying books. And so this just became sort of a something that started to build in me and build in our board members. And then fast forward to present day, where now we've got these, we have repeated issues with police violence at an inordinate rate against Black members of the community. And what we're finding is that for a myriad of reasons, which I'm sure we can weigh in on this, it's getting our attention. And hi, Bobby, thank you, welcome. It's getting our attention, and well, I'll speak for myself again, using I statements. I'm late. I'm late to the anti-racist work, and I want to learn, I want to grow, and I want to bring people along in a way that doesn't take over the Black voices who have been fighting in this space for really centuries. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to talk over those folks. We want to also speak truth to power. We want to speak truth to other white people, because unfortunately, some white people will not hear that from someone other than another white person. And even then they won't hear it. And so that is the quickest way I could kind of bring us to what created this. So we all started texting each other. Some of the boards started, oh, Sean, oh, that's awesome. Okay, sorry. So we started texting each other. We started emailing each other and saying, what's our role? What's our responsibility? We knew we didn't want to show up as experts because we're not there. We're learning, right? But at the same time, we felt an urgency to have a conversation publicly with the Relā community. And we got together, and it was this group of people who showed up on a Zoom one day, and we started to talk through not only what we wanted to say, but just all of our hearts and wanting to have this conversation in general. So I'm going to shut up for a moment and just see if any of you, Christy, Ryan, Amber, Jason, Rich, would like to kind of weigh in on really just what brought us here and why we're here tonight. I know I didn't do that good of a job. Okay,
yeah,
good.
No, I'll start. No, I mean, our organization is built on this idea of servant leadership. And I don't know, the last couple of weeks, the idea of what that means and my role in leadership and really just as a human being has become clear to me. And surrounding myself with people who want to learn and challenge and jump into some conversations that can be, frankly, a little bit scary, has just grown and significantly in the past couple weeks. So I feel like there's, like you said earlier on, Shannon, the idea of when you use your double negative, the idea of not being part of the conversation, it's not an option.
Who else?
I think that when we've been having conversations as a board, it occurred to us that we could lead by allowing people to see the discussions that we're having, the way that we are learning from one another, the way that we are humbly approaching each other's experiences and trying to listen, to lean in, and to engage in a subject that honestly has been a little uncomfortable for, I mean, I don't want to speak for everybody here, but I think that a lot of us have shied away from for much of our lives because we don't want to ruffle feathers, or we don't want to unnecessarily upset, or we don't want to offend. And it has become clear to me in my life that I can't live that way anymore. And I have to allow my convictions to guide me. And that then requires a lot of education on my part, because the reality is that I have been complacent in my own comfort, in my own privilege. And even while thinking, I mean, I've written songs about anti-racism. I have spoken out on stage many times, but I also have done that in waves. I have allowed myself to address issues when I feel like they are necessary, and then just kind of be comfortable.
And that's example of privilege, right? That, I mean, it's
right.
Privilege that gives us the ability to go, okay, I'm going to walk away now and just pretend that this doesn't exist for a while.
Right. So I think, and Rich, I don't want to put you on the spot, but some of the things that you have said has really motivated me to be actively anti-racist, to amplify voices that I believe are speaking important truth, and really to learn and to not be afraid to make mistakes. I think that one thing that has kept me from saying a lot of things in the past is I'm afraid that somehow I'm going to say something that's going to either hurt someone else or hurt myself or hurt the situation. And I'm realizing that that's actually maybe even worse, that I need to speak up and be willing to say the wrong thing. And then, like Rich said, it's important to be willing to hear when I say the wrong thing and be humble and listen.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm a board member at Relay. I remember when they announced Shannon coming on as the executive director. I was so excited. It must have been my second or third breakfast, and I made my way to the front and just wanted to congratulate her, and just to say how proud I was, just to witness that transference of leadership, because that's not common, uh, which is sad, to say. Um, but as an incredible leader, as you are, you're constantly leaning into those challenging spaces and conversations. We've seen it in the past with other events that Relays put on by diversifying the folks who are up front, as well as the conversation. And in fact, I was interested in being a part of the board because I saw it as a very influential organization that had a reach into the organizations and businesses and communities of the city that could influence and change a whole culture. You said it, early on. Relay is probably not going to change anything on the national scale, but it's connected to people who can significantly change hiring policies, housing, loans, and one-on-one personal relationships. That's the kind of influence that Relay has. And as a pastor, which I am, pastor of a local congregation here, I too see the same thing. Is I've got people who are connected in those businesses, in those relationships, neighborhoods, industries, where they can affect real life change. We started our church to be intentionally multi-ethnic because I heard MLK say back in 1963 or 64 that Sunday morning was the most segregated hour of the week. And speaking about particularly the worship space, a space that you would probably not envision would be segregated, not intentionally so, but largely it was, and it still is, unfortunately. There's about 1,200 churches in Columbus, Ohio, and less than 3% of them are multiracial, which simply means that no one group is greater than 80% of the overall congregation. And so that's really, really low. And it's low compared to a national scale of evangelical churches, which are about 15% of all evangelical churches are multiracial. So what that means for me is that I am motivated to connect and build a community of people who are confident and courageous to have these conversations. My congregation is about 55% white, and about 35 to 45% African American, and then the rest is Asian American and Latinx. And so it's a diverse congregation, but the majority of the congregation is still white. And I just think back to MLK when he was in Birmingham. He's arrested for protesting, wouldn't get off the street, thrown in jail. And the next day, 8 white pastors called his actions untimely and unwise. And thus started MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail calling for white clergy to get involved, to not make this some kind of separate issue from the relationship of being brother and sisters, in our case, in Christ together. But MLK wasn't just appealing to a religious group, he was appealing to all humanity, that we have a human connection here that's being ripped apart because of this segregation and these racist acts. So I'm here because I really want to see white people get engaged. I want to see white people get involved. If Black folks are 13% of the population, that's not enough of the population to see significant change on this. It can't just be a Black issue. It can't just be a Black problem with some other group of people. It has to be our issue. It has to be yours together in order to get engaged. So,
I want to bring up a word that has come up for me for years around this topic. I love to hear everyone's thoughts on this. It almost seems weird to talk about it, but the word is humility. And the reason why I think it's weird to talk about it is to talk about being humble doesn't necessarily look like you're being humble, but at the risk of not sounding humble,
Right.
What I mean by that is, and it's kind of my first, to me, it's the secret sauce of where to begin. If you are a white person and you are wanting to step into this space, but you're afraid of making a mistake, for example, as Ryan said, or afraid of doing more harm, or afraid of harming yourself, you don't want backlash. I think the best place to start as a launching pad is humility. And the way that occurs in my life is not just by learning and reading books, but by being willing, and this is going to be a hard pill, being willing to be corrected by someone who is not like you, by people of color, by people that you've never allowed to have speak into your life. And that may sound on the surface, well, of course, you know, I want to grow, but you watch the first time you allow someone, a person of color, to correct you, your reaction. How do you feel about that? None of us likes to be called out on anything, right? From anybody. I think that that's always a difficult thing. But having enough humility to learn and to trust other people's lived experiences, and to stop the incessant dismissal of when Black people tell us, this is my experience, and this is how I experience systemic racism, and this is what it looks like for me. Obviously, every person you talk, you know, they're not a monolith, right? There's not one experience that's lived by all. I understand that. But generally speaking, having the humility to accept their lived experience, and then to humbly look within and say, how am I a part of this? How am I a part of any of this systemic racism? And being willing to, little by little, kind of chip away at that in your own life. And so I just want to kick things off with talking about humility for a little bit. What I'd love to hear from all of you, or from a few of you, of maybe a moment, whether it's a specific example or even a generalized lesson, where you came to that moment where you were humbled in this work. I would love to hear some of those examples. I know I have plenty.
Well, I'm
So,
oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I know, it's like always that. And I did not want to go after Rich, because Rich mic drops because he's so amazing. And like, so I'm always like, oh, okay, I'm taking notes. But, you know, I think from that, one of the perspectives I've even had just in this and us, you know, having these discussions, is also you know, when those questions are asked of me that I've never even thought about. So when we first all sat down that morning to really talk about this and what did we want to talk about as an organization, and just us having a dialogue around, you know, well, I'm worried because I don't feel like I can do enough, or I worry because is this how I'm going to be perceived? And then to have someone say, well, you know, why do you even feel that way? And why? And then you have to think for a moment, I don't know why I feel that way, or I've never thought about that being a differing feeling. And so for me, in this journey, I have realized how much I've relied on. If I can't make a big impact, then I'm not making an impact. And I'm not even humbling myself to say, like, no, actually, you know, these small impacts do something. And instead I'm just thinking about, well, if I can't do the big impact, then it's kind of someone else's problem. I'm not in the position to do this thing. And so I'm kind of even removing myself a little bit from the blame by doing that. So, you know, so I've had to do a lot of self-reflection of thinking, no, there are small things, and those small things, you know, add up over time. And those small things are the things that I need to work on, and I have to own, and I have to own for myself. And so that has been, you know, a different experience. And even, you know, talking to, talking to my friends that don't look like me, or, are from different areas of even the US, and asking them, those questions, or to share those experiences with me, and so that I can just listen. And I know that right now, just asking someone of that, that's a lot. People are going through a lot of pain and hurt right now. And, as we've talked about, it's not their responsibility to educate me. But, being able to also accept, and if they say, I can't talk to you about this right now. And that's not about me, right? That is about, a place of where they are at that moment, and that's okay. So for me, there's just been lots of just different kind of ups and downs, and different ways I've even viewed kind of that humility space. And then even just being here tonight, I told you all before, I was scared coming into it. I'm scared about, what do I say? What if I say the wrong thing? What if the words that come out of my mouth aren't what I meant? So, I think it's just all of these moments that, hopefully are getting us to that continues to allow us to get to those next steps, and create action and elevate voices.
Jason, what were you going to share?
Yeah, so my experience before being a community engagement manager with Relā was being a pastor in these predominantly white evangelical churches for over a decade. And as I look back at many of the experiences and times where headlines would cultivate a conversation that hadn't typically happened in a while, it feels like in hindsight, much of the conversation was centered around everyone affirming with one another, I'm not racist, you're not racist, so we're cool here, right? And time after time, you would see thought leaders, church leaders, pastors that were more concerned, or more motivated would be a better word, to make a big statement than to make a big difference with this. And while the world is watching for thought leaders to say something, which I think is important, I think a lot of people are wondering, what does it mean to actually try to make a difference? There is a huge difference between me not being a racist and me living my life as an anti-racist. Me embracing this idea that there is a system in place which much of my life I have ignored or denied or rejected, but it is at play. And in that same system, I have the opportunity, if I'm willing to humble myself and leverage whatever opportunities and influence, whatever benefit I have, whatever privilege I have to make a difference. And so I'm learning. I'm diving into content and books and resources that I've never read before, and it's challenging, and it's revealing to me how many times I've settled for a statement instead of action. And what's even more humbling and concerning at times is, as I begin to voice these things, seeing their circles around me that embrace the system that is at play. And so it's humbling in realizing that there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of responsibility we all have. It's humbling to look back at opportunities missed to make more of a difference. And it's humbling to consider the task ahead when we're willing to really engage with this idea of living a life that is anti-racist.
You mentioned, I'm going to put a label on something that you mentioned, Jason, which is performative allyship. It's this idea that people perform as an ally. They simply post the meme, but they haven't really done any of the inner work. They haven't really learned. They haven't made policy changes or whatever. I've heard some varying opinions on this. Some people say, yeah, we don't want any performative allyship. We only want, hardcore anti-racist. But then other people said, hey, if that's a step and it gets people closer to anti-racism, to the true work, then we're all for it. I think the big lesson for all of that, for me, is that we need to be willing to do this messy. I would much rather be putting things out there in an honest but messy way. And when I say messy, I don't mean careless. I don't mean ill-informed, but what I mean is if we put something out there, or we say something or we do something, and someone comes to us and says, you know, when you did this, this is what it looked like to me, a Black person. And then you realize you did something that was inappropriate or whatever, that we then just make amends for that, right? It's called an apology. You can do that. Right. We can do it, and it shouldn't be that hard, but for some reason, so many of us are so afraid of making a mistake that we're paralyzed, and we withhold from others who might benefit from our maybe leadership or our learnings, is how I like to think about it. We withhold that from the world, and as a result, like Jason said, you know, there's missed opportunities. And so I would encourage people to at least learn out. And I'm a big fan of being quiet for a while. So I was still nervous about doing this live stream because I don't know that I've been quiet long enough. I don't know if I've learned enough yet. I don't know if it's appropriate, but I felt that as an organization, we couldn't be quiet. But I'm willing now to maybe make a mistake and to do it messy, because I'm not afraid to be corrected. I'm not afraid for someone to pull me aside. And I've had friends do this. Hey, when you made that decision or you did this thing or whatever, this is what it meant to me. And I just want you to know that. And for me to change after that. We can do that. Let's not allow perfection to keep us from moving forward. I think that can be a real hindrance. And honestly, if I'm being very blunt, I think it's an excuse. It's an excuse, because if I'm being and I'm going to say this to a man who doesn't know, he's been pastoring me online for a while, but Rich, I've been attending his church online. You know, there are.
That's you, Rich. That's you.
Come on.
Yeah. I've been convicted, even before I met Rich, I've been convicted around these things as and we're not trying to center this conversation around Christianity, but it is my lens. And as a Christian, I have been convicted around these things for a very long time. And I'll echo what Ryan said. I was living in that tension because I felt like I needed to do more. I felt like I needed to learn more. And I wasn't doing it because I was afraid. I wasn't doing it because I was afraid of correction. I was afraid of being wrong. And I wasn't afraid of being wrong because of hurting people. I was afraid of being wrong because of my pride. And that's different, right? That's different. And it hurts my heart to know that I felt that way. But now it's like the scale has shifted. And if I'm going to be criticized or hated, or people are going to be upset at me for speaking out, if other white people, and it's already happened, are going to criticize me for saying certain things and telling me I'm a tool of left propaganda or whatever, I'd much rather be criticized for that. Because as Rich has said, I want to be on the side of what Rich called shared humanity. That's what this is about to me. This is about human beings. And people, the lives of people who have been marginalized, disenfranchised, discriminated against, murdered, those lives are what are at stake right now and have been for a long time. And so what I'd like to do now is I want to get reactions to this statement. Why is it not this simple? A lot of people think that racism they don't think they're racist because they don't hate Black people, or they don't hate other nationalities or racists or races. So they think I'm not racist because I'm not against people who are different than me, right? Why is that too much of an oversimplification of what racism is? Who would like to speak on that?
Come on, white people.
I just don't want to be the only one talking, but I have strong opinions on this.
Well, I think that I have learned relatively recently that I have been advantaged by a system that gives me a significant amount of privilege that was built on largely racist ideas. And so even though I have never been racist myself, I am the recipient of an advantage that puts me many steps ahead. And because of that, I feel compelled, now that I realize that, to do something to dismantle that. It is not. It's not okay with me and my own heart to be the recipient of that kind of advantage and not to be a part of dismantling that. And I don't know what that means. I don't know how to do that, but I do feel compelled that I need to do something.
I agree, Ryan. This is a new thought for me, genuinely, in the last couple of weeks. Is if and it stemmed from a conversation with a colleague of mine. I am incredibly privileged, and if I'm incredibly privileged, then the likelihood that someone else is getting the wrong end of the stick is pretty high. And I've never ever looked at my privilege in that way. Makes me feel sad and not willing to continue.
And I want to make sure we point something out here, because I see it all the time on Facebook trolling, and that is, well, I was brought up, I was poor too. This is a white person. I was poor too, so I wasn't privileged.
Sure.
There's a difference between economic privilege and racial privilege. And just because I say, Amber, you and I have white privilege does not mean one of us or both of us didn't have hard times or have a difficult childhood or grew up poor or grew up, you know what I'm saying? That those things are not equal. That's not saying the same thing. Okay. There is an inherent privilege with white skin. And that doesn't necessarily mean you haven't had problems and you haven't struggled. So we need to differentiate between these two things. And again, back to what we said about humility. We cannot discount these truths just because they cause us cognitive dissonance. We need to dig in further and find out, what does white privilege mean? What's the difference between racial privilege, privilege because of the color of my skin, versus economic privilege? And why do I, as a white person, want to equate those things to defend myself? Why is my first reaction defense? And so I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that that's a big barrier too, Amber. People they kick back that whole idea of white privilege, and so then they throw everything out and they won't engage.
Yeah, and I do want to add, again, another new learning from one of my colleagues who's Black. She shared, when she was trying to educate me around this, she said, I'm privileged too. She helped me understand that people with darker skin, that there's differing experiences that you have. If you have light skin, if you have very dark skin, like I didn't know this, which makes me feel incredibly ignorant. But at the same time, this is a part of growing and getting educated. So many of us have privileges, regardless of the color of your skin. And understanding that, I think, has been part of my learning just in the past week.
Yeah, I think too, with that, a lot of this I've thought about things that I've never had to think about before. And, realizing as I've read things or I've talked to friends where I've thought, that's never crossed my mind. Like, I've never had to even think about, what that experience might feel like. And there are certain things, as being a female, I can talk to my male friends and say, I'm sure you've never felt, you've never had to think about this, or you've never had to, and we've had really great discussions. But even that sometimes is kind of like an easy topic to talk about. But, there have been just different things through this where I've thought not even just about my privilege, but just about my ability to live throughout my life and my existence with that never being anything that ever has popped up into my mind.
Yeah.
And even just having discussions, you know, my daughter has a great friend who's biracial, and her mom did this beautiful post the other day about her daughters having that discussion of, well, am I Black or am I white? Or, you know, what are these connection points of that? And I thought, I never, you know, when I see her daughters and these beautiful girls and this beautiful family that we love, that I never even thought about what that experience must be like for their family and for those girls. And it was that, you know, gut punch of like, why has that never crossed my mind? And, you know, I think it's that when, I think Rhonda, when she took us through, you know, one of our board, you know, exercises and conversations, when, you know, we built out that list of 10, so hopefully that's not proprietary information, but that list of 10 people in our circle, but, you know, what do they look like? What's their education? You know, where did they grow up? And just challenging those things, because it's like, once we shift our minds to remove biases and start seeing things just even in their wholeness, you know, it's that I can't unsee it. But also, how do we move from this moment to stay in this discomfort, right? We all feel like we've scratched the surface of discomfort, but we've also scratched the surface before of discomfort. We've all been, you know, a lot of us on this call have all been considered allies, and we've all been invited to the discussion before, and we've all been invited to the table. But we also quickly let the discomfort slide away when life happens. Yeah. And then we just go back to, okay, you know, all things are well. And so how do we continue to pressure ourselves to stay in that discomfort and know that this discomfort could be for a long time?
Well, let's talk about that. I'd love to hear Rich's thoughts on that. And while Rich is talking, I want to encourage people who are watching online to start putting those comments in. What do you want to know, or what are you planning to do or are doing to keep it going? But Rich, I want to hear from you on that.
Yeah, my first thought is that, first of all, race is a social construct, and it was a social construct that was created to identify one group of people superior to all other groups of people. That's why you had to have a superior group and an inferior group to be able to enslave an entire group of people. You had to justify that in such a way that would allow them to consciously enslave someone, abuse, systematically remove family members from one another, generationally keep people entrenched, and in a mindset that they could never overcome their present circumstance, which was reiterated by our Constitution when it was written. You know, Black people were 3/5 of a human, so we weren't even considered fully human. And we're talking about a system that lasted for more than 250 years. More than 250 years. That system lasted, and it didn't just go away with the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1865. It evolved into other forms of slavery. It evolved into other institutions that permeated all areas and walks and wakes of life. So even though the Constitution changed and hey, now Black people are whole now, we're fully human, the same ideology that led to writing that Black people were only 3/5 human had already been embedded generation after generation, institution after institution, which we can't just say individually, a person can't just say individually, I'm not a racist. We're in a racialized society that continues to traumatize African-American people. When people want to say, you know, a lot of times you get in the conversation and say, man, you know, if Black people just had more fathers in the home, it's like, first of all, I just got to give a little bit of context and say, for more than 300 years, Black men were removed systematically from their family members, and their wives were systematically abused, raped in some cases, and their children taken away from them and sold in other places. That does something psychologically to the mind and the body. It traumatizes the body. And it makes me feel, on one hand, incredibly prideful about being Black, because African Americans were able to endure that kind of trauma generation after generation, year after year, to the point where they said, no, one day we will all be free. But James Baldwin says this: we're not all free until they are all free. We're not all free until white people are also free, because racism is not just something that affects Black people, it's something that affects white people as well. There's this like lie and narrative about racism that many people didn't know. Even Irish people weren't considered white in the founding of, you know, this country, right? They had to apply to be white. But the application process was really quick, because in New York, Irish and Black people had started to come together in their impoverished communities to speak out against the government. And the government said, no, we're going to cut that down. Irish folks, we'll make you white, which now means you can own land, you can get better jobs, higher wages, and join politics. And that separated the people out. But every white ethnic group outside of English, British, French, and Spanish and German had to apply to be white in this country. So this whole ideology of racism affects white people as well. It's a lie that continues to like go forth and says that one is superior, you know, to the other. It's like, no, that's not true. This whole thing that's in the water and it's in the air. It's like we have to become more sophisticated about recognizing it so we can name it, call it out, and say we reject that ideology altogether. Yeah.
So a couple things that have come in. Some folks are talking about, Ryan says that one small thing he's doing is having these conversations with his kids right now. He wants to break the cycle so that they can be aware now. He said they're having amazing conversations and he finds he's learning as much from them as he's trying to impart into them, which I love that. My kids are grown and out of the house. So I think that doing that small thing around, and I don't think it's a small thing, by the way, Ryan, having those conversations with your kids is super important. What about those of you on screen here? What are some other things, some actions that you're taking to keep this going for yourself?
Along the lines of with our kids, one of the things that I'm trying to do is encourage more questions than just handing my children the answers with the stuff that they're seeing and the things that they're asking about, censoring some things less. So, you know, when the videos of George Floyd's killing were all over the news, you know, these are situations that are traumatic and scary. I have a 10-year-old son that was uncomfortable. He's trying to figure out what's going on. He began to ask questions, and I realized how often in situations like this, I would say, hey, why don't you get out here or change the channel? Or, but I found myself in more of a place of holding this intention of saying, my son needs to ask these questions and see what is happening and not be handed a narrative that is more palatable. I want him to have the opportunity to explore something that maybe I rejected for much of my life or ignored or whatever. I don't want to make excuses for myself, but I didn't see like I needed to. And so encouraging the dialogue when they're asking about the protests, when they're asking about relationship with police officers in these tense conversations, allowing them to really hash out the questions in their mind and the doubts and the frustrations that as children they're seeing as well, and foster that type of critical thinking. It's been eye-opening for me as a parent as well.
The point you're making about critical thinking brings up something for me, facts over feelings. I think that a lot of the arguments that are going on in this fight that we're in, and I do consider it a fight for anti-racism, and I don't mean a fight like literal, right? Like a battle, but that we're trying to break down structures. And some of those structures live inside of people, and some of those structures live within institutions. But what I find a lot of is people saying, well, I don't think that's true. I don't believe that because of this. And they give an example from their own life or from their opinion. And I think we talk about this in our programs when we talk about changing our mindsets, because part of what we do really well at Relā and leadership development is we talk about shifting our mindsets. And one of the things, so I want to talk about this briefly. We need to understand that every thought that comes into our mind isn't based in fact. It's not based in truth. And just because you have an opinion on something doesn't mean that it's factual, that it's based on data. It means that you have an opinion like everybody else. You're free to have your opinion. Absolutely. But that doesn't make it factual. And so in this work of anti-racism, what I encourage people to do, as soon as you're faced with information from an anti-racist perspective, and your reaction is, well, that's not true, because what's happening is you are having a pattern. There is a reaction in your brain, and I know Jim Babe's on here and could, if he was on here with us, he could say this. Something in your amygdala is reacting to that and telling you that that's not true because, and that because answer is based in your programming. It's based in an automatic thought. And sometimes those automatic thoughts are not based. In fact, a lot of times those automatic thoughts are not based in facts. And so it's important for anyone interested in the work of anti-racism to be educated and to educate yourself on the facts. Rich brought up something about, and I've been hearing this rhetoric a lot, Rich, about, well, the real problem is because there aren't enough Black fathers in the home. And as soon as I heard it, I was just so mad. I was just so pissed, because I thought, a system of racism that has described, as well as habitually incarcerated Black men, has taken Black men from their homes and made it impossible or near impossible for certain families to stay together. Then when you look at the data around how Black men are involved with their children and how those statistics are actually higher than white families, you have to look at the data. Because the news, our political leanings, our family, our history, we're influenced by so many things, but we need to do the research. What is actually true, factually, data about, let's just take that one instance, about Black fathers.
Right.
I think you will find when you look into the data that Black fathers are some of the most engaged and active parents. And they've done studies on this today. I wish I thought to have that image up. I have an image that has all these studies that have been done. And that's just one point. The big picture here is that our feelings get involved, and our feelings are important because they tell us what is causing us like dissonance in our brain, but it doesn't mean it's factual. And so I would challenge you when you feel that way to really dig in, and instead of defending your position, finding out what else might be true that I'm not understanding. I think that's all a part of being committed to this work.
I want to tell a quick story. That I used to make a living as a musician, and a member of my band was Black. He's one of my very good friends, and we were rehearsing, and we were rehearsing somewhere that we hadn't rehearsed before. It was a relatively upscale, mostly white neighborhood, and he showed up a little bit early for rehearsal. It was a house we hadn't gone to before. He went to what he thought was the correct house, went up to the door, knocked on the door. The people said, "Come on in." So he walked into the house thinking, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. He very quickly realized, oh, this is not where I'm supposed to be. He said, "I'm very sorry." He walked out, went back to his car. About 5 minutes later, as the rest of us were arriving for rehearsal, about 20 police officers arrived and came out, guns drawn, and we got out of our cars and we immediately said, "Wait a minute, what's going on?" And we said, we know him. He's supposed to be here. What's the problem? And they said, "Oh, well, we got a call from these homeowners that there was someone who was suspicious that had invaded their house," after he had been invited to come in. And at the end of that experience, the police officer, who happened to be white, said to him, "Hey, next time I'd be a little bit more careful, because if that was me, I would have shot you," and then laughed at my friend. And we all looked at him like, "Dude, what?" And so after that experience, that was a very traumatic experience. And that's something that we've talked about that was 10 years ago, over the last 10 years. Now, recently, he was tweeting that story because he felt compelled to share his experience of what it's like to be a Black man encountering police and the way that white people might respond to him, just being in their space. And he brought up the fact that it had nothing to do with him, that he was somehow cleared that he wasn't malicious and wasn't in some wrong place and wasn't trying to hurt someone. It was the fact that his white friends stepped in to say, "Oh no, this guy's okay." And it never even dawned on me that when I walked into that situation and I saw police officers and they all literally had their guns drawn at my friend, I had zero fear, literally zero fear, that was going to impact me. And we stepped in and spoke for our friend. And then all of a sudden that somehow made the situation better. And he talked about how that situation had really traumatized him. And it really struck home to me how very different my experience was from his. And that the reality of the way that race affects every single moment of every one of our lives, that little microcosm happens over and over again in our culture. And it struck me that, you talked about humbling experiences. It was a humbling experience to me now, 10 years later, that it's just now dawning on me that somehow it was my presence that de-escalated a situation. And I was no different than him. Literally, we're the same guy.
Yeah.
We're the same age, exact same socioeconomic situation, exactly the same, except I had white skin, he had Black skin. And somehow me vouching for him de-escalated the situation. Right. And I think that for those of us who maybe have never really considered the role of racism in our society, I think that we just have to have ears to hear from our friends who have experienced it firsthand. Mm-hmm. For me, I needed to hear my friend tell that story that I was a part of, to remind me that this is a real thing and I've experienced it myself. And we can't just sweep it under the rug any longer. We have to address it. We have to call it out, and we have to say this is real, and we have to share our experiences. I have to share the story so that other people can see that that's a real experience that happened, and then hopefully somehow by me sharing a story that makes Christy feel more comfortable sharing her stories, and we feel emboldened to speak out against the thing that we all see as a terrible evil in our society.
Yeah, I think, Ryan, thinking about your story, and I was thinking about what Shannon had said about, facts and truth. I think that right now, and we see this in the racial tension that's building, we see this with COVID, that if people haven't personally experienced it or know someone that has personally experienced it, then it must just not be true. And it must just be, however you want to classify it, right? It's political jargon, it's brainwash, it's whatever it is. And I think that it's those experiences and it's those stories that we hear, and then we have to receive them. We have to not question pieces of it, just hear them and receive them, and acknowledge that it did happen. And even our friends that, like you mentioned, Ryan, where they're the same person as us, the only difference is, the color of their skin it's hard to find out that something has happened to your friend, or that they've experienced it, or they've even experienced it from a mutual connection like that. That's a hard thing to hear. And it's a hard, next step conversation to have. But I think that that's a big piece of, as we all are talking here today about what are we doing to move forward, how do we, when that person says to us, well, I don't believe that that's true, because they've never heard or had a friend experience it, where we say, well, have you talked to anybody? Because here's an experience my friend had.
Yeah.
And, so that we can then share those stories, and share that they are truths, as awful as they are to hear. They are the truth, and they're the real experiences that people have had.
Yeah.
Rich, did you have something? Oh, sorry. I thought Rich had something.
This past week at Nationwide Children's Hospital and Ronald McDonald House, we on Thursday had a silent protest outside of the hospital and Ronald McDonald House. And we went out and we stood silently for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to remember the death of George Floyd, and specifically stand for his daughter, who I think has made a big impact for a lot of people, speaking about the innocence of what needs to change in our society. And after that time, one of my coworkers, who's an African American woman, we were talking, and I asked her, how do you feel? And she said, this feels like a healing. And she had tears in her eyes. And she gave me the biggest hug. I know we're not supposed to hug right now, social distancing and all that, but it was so right. And I started crying, and I'm not sure exactly why. I think I would attribute it to just the spirit moving. It's emotional. Something about it was deeply moving. And then she posted something later on Facebook, and she was talking about how she expected to be disappointed when all of this stuff started going down, because she'd worked at a lot of different places and she had seen it, and she was ready to have to step out because she couldn't stand to be in a place again that would see the blatant racism and not say anything about it. And she just was so moved by something so simple. And guys, there's so much more we can do. All we did was go stand outside for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and it moved her that much. That was incredibly convicting to me, to say how little could make that much of an impact in someone's life. And then how much more impact can we make by continuing to step out?
Thanks, Ryan. I've asked folks in the chat to send questions. I've got one I'd like to show you all and would love to hear one or two of you chime in. It's from Lisa. She says, how do we counteract those who are unwilling to listen? Those who say it's a leftist, quote unquote, agenda or overblown. Thoughts, feelings, reactions?
This has been a lot of the reaction that I'm getting as I speak out. I made a social post essentially saying that I have been silent on this for too long, and I've made it a lot about me checking my own box. And the reactions I've received over and over and over in a lot of my circles have been, well, you don't know what you're talking about, and you don't know what you're really supporting, and do you really this, and this? And it's as if, from my experience, a lot of people have rallied around this cry of this we're not, and spent so much energy and attention on what we aren't going to be or what we can't be. And a lot of times the question that I've followed up with, many times is met with the sound of crickets, but so what are you for? What are you going to do? What would you recommend? What path would you take? What solutions would you like to see? What needs to be done? How would you fix it if you could? What keeps you awake at night? And just being willing to push and lose friends that in some situations, there may be a point of tension here where it matters that much to speak out boldly. But a lot of times coming back with a question of, what would you like to see change? If you want to embrace it, what would you like to see? What do you see? Trying to find out if there even is common ground there to begin at least a dialogue and to listen. But many of my experiences have been that people can be resistant to all of it altogether because personally they don't feel like this is a problem for them, and maybe don't see the larger systemic issues altogether.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things has been just simply asking if they've had a conversation with a person, because and especially just right now. I mean, we are stuck in our homes right now, and we're disconnected, and we're or at least I feel like I'm trapped in my home half the time, but we're stuck in our homes, and we're not, and so we're reading. That's great, but we're also seeing everything through the lens of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and back to what we talked about at the very beginning of this conversation about what our actual social feeds look like. And so that's just been my thing of any narrative of any piece that has happened over the last few weeks. I've just said, have you talked to a person? Have you talked to a person who has gone to the protest in your town? Have you, and asked them, what was your experience? What was it like? Have you talked to a friend and asked them, what is their experience? And you hear a lot of times crickets, right? Because they haven't. Because they've only seen the reshare of an article or the group of everyone thinks like me, talks like me, looks like me, we think the same, close knit. And so that, that really has been, and I will admittedly say I am not a confrontational person. So as much as I'd love to say I can stand boldly, that's the thing I'm, continuing to even challenge myself with. But just, Lisa, to your question, and just asking if they've actually talked to someone, and what that experience has been for them.
Yeah, I want to add this concept of humble inquiry, which I've been on a journey to understand what that means and how to use humble inquiry to better understand others. And I encountered it in my own household this week, where I got so passionate and so excited about something that I learned, and said to my husband, well, don't you know, blah, 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 and just had all this energy around it. And he was like, I don't think that. And immediately, everything I learned about humble inquiry went out the door, because I thought, Lord, if I can't even get my own husband believing what I believe, like this, I'm not doing so hot. And then I had to realize, like, I'm on a different journey than he is, and I'm getting different information than he is, and I'm experiencing different conversations than he is. And so the things that I've learned about, well, what do you think? And help me understand where that's coming from, because the same way that I want him to listen to me, I need to listen to him and help understand from his perspective. And eventually the goal would be that we could meet somewhere and have a really healthy conversation. But I definitely felt myself putting up a wall and had to check myself if I'm going to make any impact at all.
And we have about 15 minutes left. I want to make sure we try to get to a few more questions. We've got another one here from Tim. And so Tim asks, what advice would you give someone struggling to initiate a conversation with family on systemic racism? Love that question, Tim. Thanks for submitting that. Anyone want to talk?
There's a great resource called, a book called So You Want to Talk About Race. And I think the author, Ajima Olu, has an interview on NPR with this exact same question. How do you talk to your parents about racism and systemic racism? There's a civil rights leader, John Perkins. He says, you can have Jesus in your bones, but you can have Jesus in your heart, but granddaddy in your bones. And so this stuff gets passed down from one generation to the next, to where you may be the one who sees things differently. So I think to start off and saying, again, it's been said multiple times this evening, to begin with humility, to start off with how you were ignorant, on some of these things, even in your own journey. You didn't come out the womb, embracing anti-racism. You've had to learn it. You've had to fumble through it. You've had to talk to friends. And the younger generation is far more likely to have a myriad of friends across different ethnicities and races than the generation before it. And so you've got the conversations to be able to share, with your family members. I think that first place is starting with your own humility and saying, here's how I'm learning, and maybe even some things you're learning about yourself as well. Again, the lie of America is to create all of these different divisions between one another. You know how white people think, right? And it's like, oh, time out. Not all white people. Let's not get into those kind of things. So it's always kind of trying to create this separation and division where we have an opportunity to speak from our own starting point of ignorance and how we're learning. What do you guys think? What would you say? How you talking to your parents?
I can tell you I've had several, so we're empty nesters, but my son's been home because, they shut down college, and then he graduated. He graduated on a WebEx. So yay. But he's here until he moves out of state here in another month or so. And we've had a lot of really in-depth and extensive conversations on this. And my son has a great heart. He has a thirst for learning. He's a very deep thinker. And, we both noticed in our conversation that what came out for both of us is that we both have various influences. And one of the things that has helped us have that conversation was asking questions like, are you willing to hear a different perspective? And kind of asking for someone's permission to share that new perspective, because willingness is key. If someone's not willing to hear, I'm not trying to be negative, but you're wasting your energy. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it can be a little disarming to just say, would you be willing to just consider a different perspective? Could I share that with you right now? And if not now, when? Or is this a good time? I'm a huge fan of asking permission to have that conversation, especially when we're talking about close relationships, because we do want to maintain relationships whenever possible. With that being said, someone's already mentioned it in the comments that they are unwilling to let racist comments and jokes and everything slide, and they're not willing to be nice about it. They're not willing to, it's something that we talk about in the blog post, which Dean wanted me to remind everybody that we have a bunch of resources on the website. It's on the blog, relayleadership.com, and then just go to resources in the blog, and there's a blog post in there that I wrote with a ton of resources. But one of the things in there that falls into the category of minimizing racism is this idea that we prioritize intent over impact. And so we give people a pass because we say, well, they didn't mean it that way.
Right.
Or they can't, she can't help it because she's 80 years old or whatever. You know, we give people a pass, but here's the thing. Someone may not have negative intent, but that does not free them from the responsibility of the impact of their implicit bias that comes from, that is racist, okay? And so when you're having a conversation with someone, or you want to have a conversation with them, I think you've got to decide for yourself what those boundaries are. And some of you have already stated in the comments, a boundary for me is I'm not going to play nice when it comes to racist jokes and sarcasm and things like that. I'm not going to allow it to be played off as I'm just kidding, that they were just kidding. And I think a big part of this, from my perspective, Tim, is knowing what those boundaries are for you. And then knowing what you're willing to give grace on and ask for permission for, because I think that's going to be different for everyone and might be subjective to the relationship. But for me, there's certain go, no goes, much like Jim, it's the jokes, it's the veiled racism. I'm unwilling to, I'm not willing to let that slide. And then other things I might say, that's interesting. Tell me more about that, to get people talking, and then to ask them if they'd be curious or interested in hearing a different perspective. James has a question. If you don't mind me moving on here, folks, in the last few minutes that we have. He says, what do you say to those who paint their challenges as equal? Ooh, this is good. How do you share the difference between bootstrapping, like hard work makes people successful, and the system being rigged against you? Just a light question to end on this evening. Thanks, James. You know, I was taught. Go ahead.
With these things as an either or, like it's either hard work or it's a handout. It's either hard work or it's the network that you're connected to that gives you that opportunity. Both can be true. You know, hard work can make people successful, and the system can be rigged against you. So as much as you work hard, your level of success still only can reach a certain level. Like the wealth gap and disparity between white and black people in this country is enormous. It's like 60%, difference between, and that's when you add up all of the black basketball players, football players, entertainers, and you add up all of the poor Appalachian whites, and on the other side, you still get that 60% gap. So we are dealing particularly with a system that creates enormous challenges. I was an educator for 8 years, inner city schools, as well as private schools, and you can see the difference just in education. So the challenges are not equal because you've seen it, and for some folks, it's just going to take some of that to see that data before they accept that those challenges are there.
I think go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I was going to say, and this is probably not like the right answer, but some of the things that when this has been brought up, I pointed to just even discrepancies of women in the workplace and the wage gap of that. As silly as this sounds, it's an easier thing for me to sometimes talk about and compare it to, because I do have some of like the data around that. And so I bring that up, and I find sometimes that reaction is, oh, well, yeah, I mean, I know that exists. And then it's like, okay, so if that exists, why would something else not exist?
Right.
So that's been, again, I'm not saying that that's like I'm not trying to like shift the direction, but I'm just trying to open a perspective that people are I guess they more like agree to it and believe to it that, oh yeah, we know women get paid less. Like we've all accepted that. And so it's kind of like I meet them where their acceptance is, and then challenge well, you're believing that, and you know that, and you've seen that. So why would this like next level, or this next thing not be a similar like type situation?
Right. That's good.
Sorry, Ryan.
Was there something you had, Ryan?
No, it's good. Go ahead.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time. So number one, thank you to Jason and to the board members of Relā who've joined us tonight. I so appreciate your engagement. I appreciate you diving in and taking that challenge and us learning together. And I was just I did a training this morning, and I said that I have the best boss I've ever had at Relā, which is my board. So I'm really proud of all of you, and it's an honor to work with each and every one of you. I learned so much from you. I also want to thank the guests who've joined us on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. This has been an interesting journey, and this is just scratching the surface of of how we're all feeling and what we're all learning. And I hope we did it service tonight, and that you rewatch this and share it with your networks if you feel comfortable doing so. The first few comments that I posted links to resources. One is a resource on allyship, one is a resource on anti-racism. I do want to recommend, in addition to the book that Rich shared, and by the way, Rich, I gave everyone the Amazon link to You Want to Talk About Race book. I know that Rich, I think this is just for your church, but Rich is hosting some, I forget what's called. I'm going to look at it right now. It's in my email. You're having Dismantling Racism. For those of you who are in the Christian faith community, it's called Dismantling Racism, A Biblical Journey for White Christians. And it's an 8-week program. And what they're going to be doing is they're going to be reading Austin Channing Brown's book, which is, I'm getting ready to listen to this book. It's I'm Still Here, A Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. So I strongly recommend that one. For any white person who really wants to challenge themselves, I want you to consider, I really think you should, but I just don't like the word should. I want you to consider 2 books. One is called White Fragility. It's written by a white woman. Her name is D'Angelo, first name Robin D'Angelo. And look up her YouTube videos. It'll give you a good feel for what the book is about. It will really help you privately. If you like me are struggling with your pride, it'll help you privately start to kind of break down some of the areas where we're fragile and it's hard for us to learn something new and be corrected. And then the other one, if you really want to dig deep and be challenged just as much, just around anti-racism specifically, I cannot recommend, let me get in front of my How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. This is an amazing book. And Rich, since you're an educator like me, I really nerd out over this book because you can also get a workbook companion to it. So you can read a chapter and answer the reflection questions. I'm like, ooh, this is so fun. So it's a great way to learn. It's a great resource. And he is an amazing thought leader. So those are my 2 big recommendations of those books, in addition to the 2 that Rich has recommended. And then all of those resources that I gave, those links. And then last but not least, go to the Relā blog. You'll see in my latest blog post just a myriad of resources, actions, allyship information to continue the journey. So thank you, everyone. And hopefully we'll see everyone soon. Have a good night.
Shannon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.